happy to go over my time.
Людмила?
Все нормально. Он сказал, что просто можно сказать что-нибудь про, как сказать, называется, про НАТО. Там, если,
Молчи про НАТО, я тебя прошу. Да. Вот видишь вот эту женщину? Вот эти вот с перед нами сидит, покусает.
Окей, да.
Это будет не просто ночь. Это будет Варфоломеевская ночь.
Ну я же не генот.
Станешь. Смотрит за нами.
Да.
Такой улыбки. Нам сказали быть серьезными. Вот так. Да, друзья не поверят.
Давайте, хорошо.
У нас четверть 12.
Hi, I'm Ray McGovern.
У нас примерно такое же
I'm
время.
aware by this point.
Нет, вам даже одинаково.
Bored with me.
No, no. Far from that.
What is your
Был
name?
My name's
переказ,
Chris
у нас
Gilbert.
что там, да, чуть-чуть.
Летние, зимние.
Да,
То
да,
ли вы скакали, то ли мы.
Мы скакали все время, у нас все время менялось. У нас пояса сократились, потом еще что-то менялось там.
Hey Ray, are you going to be sitting here or there?
Doesn't matter.
Okay, cool. I just need you to... No, you can sit there. That's totally fine. I just need you to just occupy one seat because we got exactly as many seats as we need.
No problem.
All right, thanks much.
Что, 5 минут позора у Ричмонда.
Покорен. Нормально.
I get the question. I don't have all day. The beer is waiting.
О,
Okay,
план.
everybody ready?
Yeah.
Я бы не сказал, что рейтинг, ну ладно.
Okay, good evening, everybody. It is now 4:47, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This workshop is called Made in the USA, Origins and Consequences of the So-Called Color Revolutions. It is sponsored by UNAC's Odessa Solidarity Campaign. I am a staff member on that campaign. My name is Kat McNeil. I'm a member of the Richmond-based Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality, and I will be guiding us through it today. So we have 7 speakers. As was the case at our last plenary, each speaker will have 8 minutes. Speakers, as you can see, Terry's got our signs. She's going to signal to you when you have 1 minute remaining and when your time is up. And because, as we all know, these things tend to go long because we all have impactful and important things to say, it is important that we stick to the time limit. And guys, we're going to try to get you out of here on time. So that is about the end of that housekeeping. So I guess without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. Chris Gilbert of Venezuela. He's going to speak on Venezuela versus imperialism, how the popular movement has resisted the counter-revolution. Mr. Gilbert is a professor, or Professor Gilbert is a professor of political science in Venezuela and a co-founder of Escuela de Cuadros, a Marxist educational program on Viva Televisión. So without further ado, here is Chris Gilbert.
Thanks very much. I wanted to say it's great to be in a space like this where, and there are not many spaces like it, where you come and people are already anti-imperialists. So also, as a basis of things. So one of the things I want to say is being anti-imperialist is really not enough. It's kind of, people, the left often thinks about a minimum and a maximum program. And actually those should be kind of a more synthetic relation between those two things. So if you say the minimum program is anti-imperialism, I think we should put some of the maximum program in there too, and the historical moment calls for that. But I'll say something more about that at the end. I'm also not used to talking in this kind of space too, because I don't really devote myself to studying the details of studying the details of the taxes of U.S. imperialism. My real interest is how to defeat it through unity of the masses, through developing a socialist program and things like that. Of course, the first thing is important, especially important in this kind of context, where people are living inside the belly of the monster, as you people say, a phrase that interestingly comes from Jose Marti, the great Cuban Procer, we say. But I think it's important to lay out some of the steps of U.S. imperialism and its hairy hand in the Venezuelan context. So to say something interesting, to start with an interesting tidbit, I actually believe that U.S. started to intervene against Chavez before Chavez was president. There was actually an attempt to do a preemptive coup d'etat, which fortunately failed, before Chavez became president in 1998. And then immediately the heat started to go on. Everyone knows there was a U.S.-sponsored coup d'etat in 2002. Following that was something that was perhaps even more dangerous, which was the owner's shutout of the petroleum company, the PDVSA, which lasted and brought a lot of people into a very bad condition. But that was also resisted. And then came the real moment of the color revolutions, because at that point they actually trained opposition students in. They took some of them to Eastern Europe, and they took some of the United States, and they trained them in programs to do these kind of like manitos blancos, the protests where they paint their hands, and it was supposed to be pacific and all these things. And that didn't work either, fortunately. I think it's important, I want to say something about why these things didn't work. But now we're in a different moment. You know, I think the whole question about color revolution existed in a certain moment in which imperialism, U.S. imperialism, was in a moment of kind of superpower, when there was much less resistance. Now, when it reaches resistance is when it takes on a more fascist character, and that's what we're living right now. The first kind of appearances of a fascist activity of the opposition in Venezuela, the pro-U.S. opposition, happened in about 2014, where they started to shoot people after they lost an election. They lost the election to Maduro, and there was kind of violent activity, and they shot a number of people, especially around Cuban-run health centers. And now it's come back in full force. Maybe you've seen the images of where they actually burned a person. They burned a person because he was black, really, because these marches tend to be white, and they saw a black person, and they said, that person's a Chavist, and we're going to burn him. And they burned him. He died two weeks later. And so if that's not fascism, I don't know what is fascism. You see, you'll probably recognize, and I don't need to preach to the converted here, that the media representation of this kind of thing is extremely crude. And that's what they play to, frankly. They look for deaths. They produce deaths in their own ranks. And then they assume that through the mediatic spin, they can blame them on the government. And so they actually kill people in their own ranks sometimes through sniper fire, but other techniques, and they blame the government for that. So I come from Caracas, it's every day changing, right? Every day there's a new development, every day there's different springing up of protest, and it's really a conflictual situation of balancing forces. I think the Venezuelan movement, the Venezuelan revolution and process will actually win this battle. And I think maybe that's the most important message I can give to you all, because it's one thing to expose imperialism, but it's another thing to show how you can actually defeat it. When Hugo Chavez faced the opposition in 2007, he said, they're trying to do a color revolution, and it's not going to win. And it's not going to win because we have popular support. And that's the best way to defeat a color revolution, is to have the people on your side. And that turned out to be the case. And I think it's been the long-standing lesson of the Venezuelan movement, that the popular mass is on your side. And there's an important thing about why the popular mass is on people's side. And that's partly because the revolution has very deep historical roots. The revolution is not accidentally called the Bolivarian process. So it has immediately a reference of about 200 years, because it refers to the independence struggle that happened 200 years ago. And as is perhaps not well known, that independence struggle was also a social struggle. It also proposed such things as freedom of the slaves. It proposed land reform. And these things were not carried out, but they were part of the project of the original revolution. So it's these deep historical roots that are not going to be defeated easily, that the opposition will not be able to defeat. Even if they manage to arrive to the presidency, they will face a powerful movement of resistance. And as many examples show, these processes that have deep historical roots cannot simply be displaced from one thing to another. I think another very important thing about the Venezuelan process is, as the woman who spoke about Korea said, right now sometimes I see that Northern solidarity is quivering, is becoming ambivalent, ambiguous. And that's a totally crazy idea, because the thing has actually an existential dimension. It's about a large mass of people who have decided they have a right to exist in the world. And they're not easily going to be displaced by a group of people who are essentially, it's essentially about class struggle. And there's a racist dimension to the opposition. And people are not going to let a racist minority kick them out of history, kick them out of the mainstream of history, which is what the opposition proposes. And so this is really a question not just of a government who happens to be in place or a small government's errors. That would be a crazy way of seeing it. It's actually about a question of a large majority of a people and their decision to exist on the earth. I think what people should do here, of course, people should be very careful about how they read the media. They should ask questions about what happened. Now, everyone here is already convinced anti-imperialist, but then you have to do education in your context. So people should point out, if a person dies, they should investigate why that person died. They should also always ask the question of what social class is trying to carry out a given protest, or what social class is behind a given proposal. Social class is particularly difficult to read across cultures. But in Venezuela, the basis of this movement are rich people, and they're part of Caracas. And they have not, and I do not think they will be able to mobilize poor people to their side, in spite of the grave economic problems that exist. I have 1 minute left, apparently, and I wanted to say something, come back to something I said at the start at the beginning. It's not enough to be anti-imperialist, and it's actually foolish to be anti-imperialist. The essential, Jose Maria Ategui, who's one of the great Latin American Marxists, said, Latin America sería socialista o no será. Essentially, Latin America will be socialist or it won't exist. The only hope to be a successful, long-standing imperialist project is a project that raises the socialist question, that returns to questions basically of use value, and the basic use value is human life. The planet is another basic use value, and says that these things are more important than what imperialism works on, which is essentially exchange value, which is a series of abstractions. Currently, imperialism has a financial character, which is extremely abstract. So I think that I see that young people around the world are interested in socialism, and it would be a mistake for us to sit back with a minimal program and not try to fuse these two programs, anti-imperialism and socialism. The moment points to that being successful. I want to end with a Venezuelan proverb which says, the pueblo es un cuero seco, tú lo pisas por un lado y se levanta por el otro. And that means a people is a dry cattle skin. It's a folky message. and you step on it by one side and it jumps up on the other. You can't step it down because it keeps jumping up on one side. And that's true, and I see that even here in Richmond. The young people are resisting, they invent new ways of resisting, they can't be kept down. And it's great to be in a context like this where people are willing to struggle and they're engaged in winning, actually. And I think that's the important thing about the Venezuelan context. The left has often found itself to be in a condition of a victim. It's often found itself reduced to hand-wringing. And what the Venezuelan context shows us is you can do more than hand-wringing. You can actually win. And you can actually defeat imperialism, as was shown in the case of Playa Girón and the Cuban cases. So we shouldn't be afraid of our victories, and we should defend our victories. Thank you.
All right, that was Chris Gilbert, everybody. And next up, we have Nikola Ruzic, and he is the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Picat, a political weekly out of Belgrade. He is the host of New Sputnik Order, a radio talk show on Sputnik Serbia, and he is the author of WikiLeaks, The Secrets of Belgrade Cables, published in 2011, and The Third Bullet, Political Background of the Assassination of Zoran Djigic in 2014. All right, Nikola, here you are.
Thank you. So, the cost of Serbia's color revolution, that's my topic. If we are to believe Strobe Talbot, former US Deputy Secretary of State, NATO did not bomb Serbia in '99 due to the plight of Kosovar Albanians, but because of Serbia's resistance to the broader trends of political and economic reforms. After the Kosovo War ended, what was left of Serbia continued to resist those political and economical reforms. Slobodan Milosevic remained in power in Serbia minus Kosovo. And that meant that the war had... Okay. That meant that the war had to be continued, albeit with different means. The bombs were replaced by Serbia's color revolution, also known in Serbia as bulldozer revolution on October 5th, 2000. Here is an observation that we have to keep in mind, even though it is rather obvious. Color revolutions are not an end by themselves, but a mean for achieving a desired end. Serbia's color revolution, as any other, was not an end of the process, but its beginning. In Serbia's case, it was the beginning of a final phase of a process of bringing the country to align with Western interests, a process that had begun with sanctions and which was continued with the NATO bombing. So how was Serbia's color revolution organized, and what was, or rather still is, its outcome? First of all, it should be noted that social conditions for Milosevic's removal from power did exist. In a nutshell, people, after a decade of wars and poverty and isolation, people became tired of all that and willing to believe that Milosevic's removal from the office would solve all of their problems, ranging from the economy to Kosovo, because Milosevic's opponents claimed that Kosovo would return to Serbia once Western-style democracy is established. Of course, none of that happened. So Milosevic's final public warning that the West isn't attacking Serbia because of Milosevic, but it is attacking Milosevic because of Serbia, it fell on deaf ears, including my own at the time. So nobody believed him when he said that Western powers want to put the entire Balkans under their control, that Kosovo would become independent, that the economy would be further devastated through privatization and plundering of the state and public-owned assets. Beginnings of Serbia's color revolution in 2000 can be traced at least back to 1997, when USA and Great Britain, assisted by George Soros and his Open Society Foundation, started financing the network of local so-called independent electronic media. Their desire, of course, was to counter the influence of Milosevic-controlled state-owned media. Basically, Milosevic's propaganda was countered by Western propaganda, disguised under the label of independent journalism. Second part of the operation was bringing together Serbian opposition parties, which were too weak and too corrupted to fight on their own. Americans formed, financed, and trained the democratic opposition of Serbia, this conglomerate of 17 political parties that stood against Milosevic. But simultaneously, that was the essential part of the operation. The youth movement Otpor, resistance, was created as it was one of the essential tools for galvanizing wider public support for the fight against Milosevic. The movement came out of nowhere with fresh young faces at the front, without one leader, but with only one message: he has to go, he's finished. So everything seemed spontaneous. Milosevic's media claimed otherwise, that Otpor was created by Americans, but nobody believed them. However, shortly after the revolution, both Washington Post and New York Times published detailed accounts of how Americans financed and trained members of Otpor movement, how they were trained in Budapest, in Hungary, by the principal speaker was retired U.S. Colonel Robert Helaby. Part of the preparation for Serbia's revolution was undermining Milosevic's power structure from inside. Some of the officials were persuaded to switch sides with bribes or threats. That's what Sky News journalist Tim Marshall suggests in his book Shadow Play. And indeed, when the day several prominent members of the ruling structure did turn to the opposition, including the former chief of Yugoslav Army, General Staff Momčilo Perišić, and in 2002 he was arrested for spying for the Americans. He was caught in the act with CIA agent John David Neighbor. So, but more importantly, on October the 5th itself, a number of high and mid-level police and army officers just refused to follow orders, and by doing that, they basically enabled the demonstrators to seize the parliament building, the state TV, other key points for success of this democratic revolution, which really resembled a coup d'etat. But besides bribes and threats, and this is one I think very important part of the whole operation, Tim Marshall claims that in some cases fear proved to be a powerful motivator. A number of prominent government officials were murdered over the course of many months. To this day, it is not known who was responsible. A Serbian industrialist who had intelligence contacts observed a lot of people started thinking, well, if the Americans can get the defense minister, they can easily get me. It followed on that the people began to look for a way off the sinking ship. And in this regard, this is what Neil Clark wrote in The Guardian in 2003. There is evidence that underworld groups linked to US intelligence carried out a series of assassinations of key supporters of Milosevic regime, including Defense Minister Pavle Bulatovic and Žika Petrovic, head of Yugoslav Airlines. And it should be added that representatives of Milosevic's government, when those assassinations took place, claimed that the West organized them. So the assassins were never discovered, but what is undisputable is the fact that several of the most prominent criminal groups in Serbia really did play an important role in the October 5th events. And it is also a fact that the CIA had at least one of their assets, a person named Čedomir Mihajlović, placed in the largest criminal gang in the country at that time. Anyhow, when the day came, Milosevic's regime fell like a house of cards. And how much money did the US invest in Serbia's, and under quotation, Serbia's revolution? Washington Post wrote in late 2000 that the figure was $41 million from the US budget alone in 1999 and 2000. Baden Lebor, in his book on Milosevic, writes about $70 million. William Montgomery, former US ambassador in Belgrade and the man who organized the whole thing while being in Budapest, said that it was more than 100 million. But later he clarified that he actually doesn't know the exact figure, but that the United States considered that Milosevic has got to go and that no expense and no effort should be spared to achieve that goal. But no matter how much the investment was, it cost actually Serbia dearly, as Serbia, after the revolution, stopped resisting those mentioned broader trends of political and economic reforms. So what was the cost of these reforms? According to the official data, almost all publicly owned enterprises were sold between 2002 and 2011 for a meager 2.6 billion euros. Meanwhile, International Consortium of Investigative Journalists calculated that $51 billion were taken out of the country using the privatization law that was, of course, brought under the influence and encouragement of IMF and the World Bank. And the final result, 2/3 of the privatized company went bankrupt several years after the privatization. And in 2012, industrial production in Serbia was at a lower level than it was in 1999, the year of NATO aggression in Serbia, when nothing worked. And there was a political price to be paid in form of obligatory EU membership accession process, even though less than half of Serbian population supports Serbia's EU membership, and as much as 3/4 of positive formal recognition of Kosovo would become a condition, and it will become the condition. And simultaneously, despite the fact that only around 10% of Serbians support the country's NATO membership, Serbia's cooperation with NATO is steadily becoming deeper, with our army being reformed according to US interests, as WikiLeaks' US diplomatic cables revealed. So that was what Serbia's color revolution was about. What do Serbs think of it 17 years later? They voted the entire October 5th political class out of the office with a 2/3 majority in the last parliamentary elections. But in spite of that, Serbia still lingers on the course that was set on that day. Thank you.
And that was Nikola Vrzic, everybody. Next up, we have Alexander Prigarin, Dr. Alexander Prigarin, excuse me. He is a doctor of historical sciences and professor at the Department of Archaeology and Ethnology of Ukraine at Odessa National University, a social anthropologist who studies the formation and development of cross-cultural environment in the southern Ukraine in a Eurasian perspective, an expert on interethnic relations of Eastern Europe, cultural and community specificity and identity of ethnic groups. Everybody, please welcome Alexander Prigarin.
Good afternoon, Richmond. Good night, Odessa. I'm first time in United States at my debut. I hope that next time. Very grateful to the organizer of this action and take part in the discussions such important issues in framework of UNAC. Separative graduated Odessa Solidarity Camping for their support and willingness to help in difficult, very complex time for us. Thank you. Now, after some time in the comparative perspective of similar events, no one methodological questions that the events in Ukraine in 2014 are a number of similar color revolutions. Color revolutions, this is technology beginning in world late 1980s years, twice used in Ukrainian, 24 and 2014 years. With all the massive and spontaneous protests of the all people of country, which combine the similar revolutions, the obvious factor of totalitarianism or imperialism, foreign and domestic. A clear plan, crown seat of the technique at symbols control of the main code events, paramilitary rhetoric and tactics anything group take this technology from the aviation elements in the area of conspirative theory, conspiracy of the minority, which skillfully concealed of demonstrations of dominance. Thanks. For example, thanks. Reinforced declarations of paciful protest, permanent declarations of paciful protest against the background of gunmen occupied in military ammunitions, or insistence on universality these events of protest in majority all country. In this time, my domestic inhabitant of Kiev, Lvov, Dnipropetrovsk not participating in street protest. Now understand the mechanism and form control these revolutions. The import technology, the manipulations on public opinion, the creative of comprador elite, a group co-opted the thought in the interesting of foreign power. A formal recognition of this as pathos purifications. Much has been done in the study specific technology, how to make a natural protest movement in pragmatic, controlled actions. Recreated the stage of preparations and tactical groups, the deployment of a massive stage action. For me, as an anthropologist, the question sounds as follows. As only semiotically setting this space of protest, or rebellion shall be in the carnival of the absurd. Absurd is the was born new absurd and which born new protest. The experience of observations over two-time Ukrainian Maidan convinced me of the number common trends which give the tools external directors. At the same time, I wonder the relationship center-periphery. It is the region covered by any authority as revolutionary. In this case, the surrounding territories was not given the same rights. When in Kiev on the Maidan and Islamic his traditions picked up by the individual regional center, and no one thought to provide them with similar demonstrations. On behalf of the all people could speak only a totalitarian center, hiding behind the slogans of democracy, but built its legitimacy by mobilizing the whole country. When part of this country acted in a similar way, it is an nonsense or ochlocratical parody. The tragic the main tragic these situations in my native Odessa or Donbass or other territory. Now civil war continue. It seems that it's very far from solar Richmond. But first time the chaos in Ukrainian was arranged, including at the expense of taxes this possible town. And secondly, imagine such a picture. You live in Richmond, honor of George Washington, going to walk, raise child, but sometime somewhere in Facebook organized the different group, virtual community, fans of Roosevelt or party love beer, or club red and other. Because nothing terrible. This was not confrontations. For some strange conclusion, this group appear as protest in Washington and seize power with the direct help to foreign capital from other powerful country. For example, the Russian hacker mobilized American society in this group in Facebook. Thanks. And your neighbor suddenly bring in the you continue and live, but in Washington came laws and another better. For example, banning other hair colors except red. Yesterday, how many blondes dies in these colors? And your neighbor suddenly brings in the phobia that your son, he remember dark hairs. But he decided beer, drink Pepsi Cola. And this absurdity is which we live in is a little difference from the pictures that I have present here. It is not utopia or fantasy. It's our present, but maybe possibly your future. Post-democracy as a model of state in social system are a reality in several states, which until recently shared other values. Thank you for your attention.
All right, that was Dr. Alexander Pigarin. Next up, we have Professor Ludmila Pichacheva. She is an associate professor at Russian State University for the Humanities. She volunteers with the Russian World Patriotic Veterans and research related to the Holocaust in the International Science and Education Center in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies portion of the Russian State University. And today she will be speaking on the current anti-government protests in Russia.
Thank you. So thank you so much. I'm very glad to participate in the UNAC conference and as well as to take part in this panel that is devoted to a very crucial problem, the technologies of color of flower revolutions abroad and in Russia as well. What about Russia? Because my colleagues have delivered their speeches on this problem related to the color revolution in their countries. And what about Russia? The technologies of color revolution are actively used in Russia as well. And I would like to say that according to 2007 survey, it was observed a total decline of political activity in Russia, but it couldn't be predicted a sharp rise of political movements and anti-governmental protests in 2011. So we can saw that anti-government protests in December 2011 and March 2012 at the Bolotnaya Square. With the main Russian oppositioners such as Alexei Navalny, Ilya Yashin, Julia Chirikova. and in different regions in Russia as well, gathered thousands of people and became the issue under discussion. But according to 2015 official and independent service, it was a decline in for example, 30% of Russians in 2015 versus 22% of Russians in 2012 have more negative attitude to uprisings and protests that lead to the collapse of the country at large. You know that the technologies of color revolutions are the most effective tools of the spread of democratic values and ideas. And as I have said before, 198 methods of nonviolent action were described in the book of Gene Sharp. But anyway, I would like to focus on some anti-governmental protests that were held in Moscow and in some Russian cities in 2017. So the first anti-protestal governments took place on the 26th of March 2017, and the protests in Moscow, anti-governmental protests in Moscow, were organized by Alexei Navalny and his followers. One of the interesting features of these protests was the increasing numbers of young people, of the youth, especially students. And according to the both official and autonomous sources, these students were promised to be financially supported, to give money. So what about the second anti-governmental protest? I would like to say that they took place on the 2nd of April 2017. And you know that social nets and new technologies became one of the perfect means for organizing different riots and anti-governmental protests. And before this day, some groups on VK is like Facebook. VK is a well-known Russian social net, and it's very popular, not among youth, but among adults. And before this day, before the 2nd of April 2017, some groups with different mottos, such as we need reforms in the country, we are against misrule, mismanagement and corruption, or for example, let's participate in anti-governmental riots on the Red Square. And all these groups were people who belonged to these groups on VK wanted to force people to participate in these actions, in these unauthorized actions. And concerning official and independent sources, a very big, just a big amount of followers of these VK groups were bots, unreal internet users. It's also very interesting. And the second mass anti-governmental protest took place on the 12th of June 2017 in Moscow. And first of all, the authorities and the activists came to an agreement about the location and about the form of these anti-governmental protests. But before this day, Alexei Navalny and some of his followers decided to change the location of these protests. And so Alexei Navalny was behind the bars on the 12th of June 2017, but his followers came to the center of Moscow, and it was just lots of provocations. Lots of young people at the age of 15 and 25, and pensioners took part in these protests. Thanks you so much. Thanks to journalists and independent experts, it's also known that some of the activists in Russia have very close connections with the National Endowment for Democracy and National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. And of course, we need changes, but first of all, we need constructive changes and reforms. But Protestants exaggerate social, economic, and political problems, and they do not try to solve these problems. I think that, yeah, thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I will answer them with pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, and that was Professor Pichichivia. Thank you very much. And next up, we have Matthias Benyik of Hungary. He will be presenting on George Soros's Open Society Foundations and their role in color revolutions. Mr. Benyik is chairman of the Hungarian chapter of ATTAC, ATTAC, an international movement for democratic control of financial markets and their institutions. He is an economist and social scientist who is specialized in trade policy issues and economic integration. He's participated in several international and national campaigns against George Soros's various foundations and the World Trade Organization, as well as anti-war, anti-fascist, and anti-poverty issues. So, without further ado, here is Matthias Benyik.
Thank you again. As far as George Soros' role in the color revolutions, I also prepared a text which is too long. So again, I have to, to be in the time limit. I will concentrate on the main issues. So. George Soros foundations all around the world is well known. And the people opinion about Soros is changing, of course, differently, because if you are a liberal mainly and you are on the side of the capitalist system, then of course they are praising Soros. But it is not so clear. However, I would say that Soros was also an important figure to teach or to help the present Prime Minister Viktor Orban to power. And Viktor Orban was studying at Soros Church Foundation's money. So at the moment, I would say that the main problem with Soros is that the previous socialist system was helped to bring down by George Soros foundations. So all the color revolutions, we can see the role of Soros as a negative. And not only in the color revolution, as I mentioned, but also in the Hungarian system change. And all over the world where there is tension and trying to bring down progressive forces, leftist forces, you can find the hand of Soros. I don't know, I don't have time to go into detail of Soros' CV or his, starting from Hungary and going through London and coming to the United States. Anybody who is interested in Soros' life, you can find many articles on the internet, and I will not go into details on that. So what I would like to emphasize that the revolutionary organizations and the working class movements are, of course, in a deep how would I say, in reducing the resistance of the working class people, because the organizations of the left in the different countries are not promoted. There is no mass support. So I don't want to exaggerate the role of Soros. And my main critique is that in the previous socialist countries, the working class is unable to organize themselves from the bottom up to make a real strong movement. So why we joining UNAC? Because we think this organization is the right one to try to unite on the different issues and to bring back, a humanistic society all over the world. And this mission is welcome, and I'm very glad to be part of this UNAC. Thank you.
All right, and that was Matthias Bentik, everybody. Thank you very much. Next up, we have Phil Waledo. He will be presenting on the U.S. role in Iran's Green Movement. Mr. Waledo is the editor of the Virginia Defender newspaper, the coordinator of the Odessa Solidarity Campaign, a board member of the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran. He wrote in defense of Iran, Notes from a U.S. Peace Delegation's Journey Through the Islamic Republic, published 2007, and an open letter to the anti-war movement, How Should We Respond to the Events in Iran? That was published in 2009. And without further ado, here is Phil Waledo.
Thanks. I'm going to talk about Iran's green movement, and I'm going to time myself here, because it bears all the hallmarks of a color revolution, although it was not successful, and so it's interesting in that regard. Back in 2009. There was an election. President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was running for a second term, and he had several opponents, and the most prominent of which was a man named Mir Hossein Mousavi. And Mousavi was projected in the West to be a reformer and a moderate, while President Ahmadinejad, if you remember, was projected as being literally a crazy man, someone who denied the Holocaust, anti-Semitic, very reckless in dealing with the West, and so on. And the book that I wrote after touring Iran and then spending the next year researching the country and talking to Iranian Americans and so on, we were able to expose a lot of these lies. Ahmadinejad did not deny the Holocaust. He said, if there was a Holocaust, remember that word, if, it happened on European soil, was conducted by European people against European Jewry. Why do the Palestinians have to sacrifice their land as a solution? And I had the opportunity to have a conversation with the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations And we had been hosting meetings. I had pulled together several meetings for President Ahmadinejad of peace and social justice activists in New York. And I had an opportunity to speak with him one time, and I said, you know, I know everybody wants you to tell you how to run your affairs. You know, all the peace activists have suggestions for you, you know, like President Ahmadinejad should wear a little better clothes. You know, he doesn't really look like a president. Really, they said stuff like this. Shave his beard, that would help. I said, but if there was one thing I could suggest, if he could just say, don't use the word if. Don't say if the Holocaust. And the ambassador said, why not? I said, because, you know, then it raises the question of maybe he's saying it didn't happen. He said, that's not what if means in Farsi. In Farsi, it means, you know, it happened, and in that case, why did this happen? It doesn't mean a condition. It doesn't raise a question. You know, and that's an example of how the West can you know, he never said wipe Israel off the map. That phrase does not exist in Farsi. He was quoting Ayatollah Khomeini, who said that the Zionist entity will disappear from the face of the earth. He meant in an historical sense. And Ahmadinejad explained this to Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez in an interview. He says it's going to collapse like the Soviet Union did. He was never saying Iran should attack Israel and kill Jews. As a matter of fact, Iran has the largest number of Jews in any country in the Middle East outside of Israel. That's the truth. Some 30,000. They have synagogues and mosques and so on. And Ahmadinejad donated some money to the Jewish hospital. And during the revolution, the Ayatollah Khomeini sent a personal note to the Jewish hospital and thanked them for caring for victims of both sides of the revolution. So, I mean, that was one example of the types of lies that were told. But in 2009, there was an election, and Musavi was portrayed as the reformist, and he lost. And the government said Ahmadinejad won by about 2/3 of the vote, and the West said that's absolutely impossible. He was a horrible dictator. He had no support in the country. And interestingly enough, a research company funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, which includes on its board of directors Newt Gingrich and Condoleezza Rice, did a poll in Iran, and they predicted that Ahmadinejad would win the vote by 2/3, because he's an economic populist, and 2/3 of the country is poor and working class. And Musavi's support was based in the Western-oriented, middle-class, educated, particularly youth, particularly in the north of Tehran, which is sort of like the Upper West Side and Upper East Side in New York City, as opposed to the South Bronx or South Tehran, where Ahmadinejad had his support. I can't go into all the details and so on, but Musavi, before the election, declared that it would be stolen. And when he lost, his supporters went out on the streets in protest, in pro-democracy protests that were really played up in the West, and they became violent, and they were suppressed. And the reports that were given here was that the government initiated the violence, and you know, I looked into it extensively, and those were lies. The violence started, and this was all from Western sources that we got this from Reuters, from BBC, from so on, that it was a section of the protesters who became violent, a section that was not really representative of the main protests. And I know this because I spoke to friends of mine who were in the protests as observers. You know, they were very horrified by the whole thing, actually. But on both, you know, just the violence of it, but they said that there were squads of young people who were obviously operating with discipline and organization, who were burning buses and attacking, trying to force the crowd to attack police and so on. These are the characteristics of a color movement. You have to look at the social base. As Brother Gilbert said about the Venezuela situation, the counter-revolutionary protests in Venezuela, and it says, even the Associated Press will report that, they start in the upper-class neighborhoods. They make a big point of saying that. In Tehran, the protests were all in North Tehran, which is the better off more modernized section of the city as opposed to South Tehran, which I have visited, and it's traditional, traditionally religious, more so than the north, but that doesn't necessarily mean politically conservative. People voted their economic interests. 2 weeks after the election, the same two researchers that did the poll for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund had an op-ed in the Washington Post in which they said, I know everybody's saying that Ahmadinejad stole the election, but this was completely consistent with the research that we did before the revolution. What was different about the Iranian Revolution is that the United States does not have NGOs there. George Soros does not have a presence in Iran. The U.S. Agency for International Development doesn't operate in Iran. There's no embassy in Iran. So there was no way to funnel. I mean, Soros brags about how he bought photocopiers and spread them all through the socialist republics when there was a Soviet Union, you know, to support dissidents and so on. That situation did not exist. I have 20 seconds remaining. Okay. And by the way, you kept holding up the same, you have 1 minute left before in the previous speaker. So tell me to be quiet. I'm almost finished. You have to look for the class basis of the opposition. You have to look for the political demands. They're always for democracy and against corruption. But Mousavi was supported, his main financial supporter was Hussein Rafsanjani, who the Forbes magazine describes as one of the richest men in the world, who owns 300 private universities, and whose political philosophy is privatization of government resources, cutbacks in social services, and deregulation of industry. I know a woman whose Iranian husband sent him a copy of Alan Greenspan's economic books, and Rafsanjani wrote back and said, I've already read those. So he was the financial backer and the political manipulator for Mousavi, who was the symbol for the Green Movement. Most of the people on the streets were good people. I know that. But they were manipulated by wealthy Iranians oh, that was it. Okay. And that's what we have to look for in the color revolutions. Thank you.
All right, that was Phil Willeto. And last but certainly not least, we have Ray McGovern, who's going to give us sort of an overview. Mr. McGovern is a former Army infantry intelligence officer and CIA analyst who served under 7 presidents and 9 CIA directors. He was one of the senior analysts who prepared and briefed the president's daily brief. He also chaired the National Intelligence Estimates. He is a co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and his website is raymcgovern.com. And he will come on up and talk to us.
Thank you, Kent. First off, truth in advertising. I'm from the South Bronx, and we all voted for Ahmadinejad. He was the people's, and the Republic, the People's Republic of the Bronx, is now voting as I speak to deny Colin Powell and Attorney General Eric Holder, both of them born in the Bronx, their Bronx citizenship. We're revoking their passports. Now, about this Green Revolution, there's only one Green Revolution, Phil, and that's the one 100 years ago in Dublin. All right, now, don't be forgetting about the real Green Revolution. I'd like to talk a little bit about the way we used to do color revolutions, and we used to do it with the Marines. It was a lot cleaner, it was a lot easier, and it was easy to explain too. These color revolutions are kind of a real bummer to explain. Here's the captain of all these earlier revolutions. His name was Major General Smedley Butler. And he was the winner of two, not one, but two Medals of Honor. This is what he said. Yeah, I joined the Marine Corps at age 17, sort of like Mad Dog Mattis. No, Smedley Butler didn't say that, but that's about like, I think Mad Dog Mattis was at 19 or so. Okay, and I commanded expeditions to the Philippines, China, Nicaragua, Cuba, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Haiti. Whoa, winning 2 Medals of Honor. 4 years later, he said this: I spent 33 years and 4 months in the active service as a member of our country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. Most of my time was spent as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. I helped make Mexico especially safe for oil interests, 1914. I helped Haiti and Cuba, decent place for National City Bank. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909. Sugar interests, Dominican Republic. Honduras made that right for American fruit companies in 1903. During those years, I had, as the boys in the back room says, a swell racket. I was rewarded with honors. Looking back at it, I feel I might have given Al Capone some lessons. At best he could do was operate in 3 city districts. I operated in the whole world. Now, the Marines are pretty active still in certain areas, especially in Latin America, but they can't do much in places like Europe where they're close to what used to be the Soviet Union and now is Russia. Now we have a different way of proceeding. We don't use the Marines, and we generally don't speak about using the CIA because they've changed their name into the National Endowment for Democracy. Sounds a lot better than the Covert Action Staff, doesn't it? National Endowment for Democracy, got that? NED. Now, I want to say a word about that because Cole Gershman, the head of NED, is really quite an interesting guy. He wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post a month before the election last year, so in early October, and he said, you know, liberals in Russia aren't strong enough to stop Putin, but we are. Oh, we are, yeah. That's what he said. The United States has the power to contain this danger. The issue is whether we'll summon the will and the money to do so. Whoa, that's interesting. If I were Putin, I would read that with interest. Here's Gershman. He says that the NED is ready for fixing things in what we now call regime change, and it traces its antecedents back to 1983 when Reagan and CIA Director Casey thought they'd give a better name to the covert action overthrowers of government staff and decided to call it the NED, which circulates its money through NGOs. And at the time of the putsch, the coup in Ukraine, we identified about 63 NGOs funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. The other thing he said here was that this is really interesting. He said, besides Ukraine, Russians too face a choice. They may find themselves, Putin especially, on the losing end, not just in the near abroad, read Ukraine, but within Russia itself. In other words, Russia saw Ukraine as sort of a little stepping stone for regime change in Moscow. And as you know, 5 months later, there was a coup in Kiev. So what I'm saying here, and I'm trying to figure out how much time I have left to say it. Yeah, that's okay. We have a situation here where the methods have changed, but the objectives appear the same. And when you get colors put on revolutions, well, that's just window dressing, really. What they're trying to do is remove these people. And the only effect it's really having is to make Putin more and more popular. He enjoys about 80% approval rating. And, you know, when Megyn Kelly interviewed him. Some of you, I hope, saw that. When Megyn Kelly interviewed Putin, you know, one of the tough questions she asked, what about oppression? What about oppression in Russia? You know? And of course, well, what he said was simply this: we have our laws, and people get permits for demonstrations. When they violate those things, they get arrested. But you'll notice something about our police. They don't have automatic weapons. They don't have any weapons at all, actually, the ones that contain the crowds. And they don't really need them because the citizens don't, by and large, have weapons. You know, it's not easy to get a weapon in Russia. So what's he saying? He's saying, look, you know, we're very different here, and you pretend to have this sort of moral superiority, but you know, I look at your TV, and I think, for example, he says, what happened to Occupy Wall Street? Occupy Wall Street. He says, you got all your security forces around, CIA, FBI, Homeland Security, you know, how many are there? He says, and you got a fusion center, and this is Putin. He says, then a gun is Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street. Well, that's the way they look at us. That's where we are, folks. And so you can forgive folks for looking at us a little bit hypocritically. Indeed, you know, in many senses, we succeed marvelously in giving hypocrisy a bad name. Thank you very much.
Okay, folks, thank you so much. This concludes our workshop. And next up, after the workshops, because as you can tell, this was supposed to be the 3:30 to 4:30 p.m., I do want to announce that we did only go over by 8 minutes, so I think we're doing pretty well. The time is currently 5:54. We had a break scheduled after this. We're going to try to do as little as possible of the break, so there's going to be a 5-minute break. Then you're going to be back in here for the 5th plenary panel. So thank you all so much. No.